Let's imagine you complete a research study or a literature review and you want to write up what you found. In the social sciences, that paper would generally be in APA style. So this video is going to walk you through the first and often hardest part of writing an APA paper, which is the introduction section. And we'll discuss both the content and how to format it in APA style. And since you'll be citing a lot of research in your introduction section, we'll also talk about how to format a references section where you can put the full information for all those sources that you cited. But first, let's zoom out and look at the pieces of a typical paper. APA style can actually accommodate many types of papers, from literature reviews to theory papers, but by far the most common, and the one we'll concentrate on here, is an empirical paper or empirical article, which just means one that reports some new findings, collects some new data, presents some new statistical results, that sort of thing. The first thing you'll notice on basically any peer-reviewed journal article, and thus also in an APA-style paper, is the basic info like title and who the authors are, and then an abstract, which is basically a paragraph briefly summarizing the whole article. But this is information we can fill in later, and in fact it makes sense to write the bulk of the paper first before trying to distill it down to a single paragraph summary in that abstract. But after that stuff, that's when you get into the body of the paper, the real meat of the paper. And for an empirical paper reporting some results, you'll typically see these 4 sections. First, there's a section to introduce the topic and motivate why this study was done. Then a method section to describe in detail how the study was carried out, who or what was studied, and how data was collected. Then you've got a results section where data is presented, often in tables and graphs, and usually with some statistical analysis, either to summarize the data descriptively or to use inferential statistics to draw some wider conclusions. And then finally there's a discussion section which has the conclusions and takeaways, but also acknowledges limitations and next steps. Now, the names of these sections, those main headings you see, they're actually adjustable in APA style, like if you're writing something other than an empirical article, but this is the standard and most common layout of a social science article. And finally, you'll find a separate section or two at the very end, below the body of the paper, with some important extras. First, a references section, where you give the full information for every citation that you actually used in the paper. And then optionally, there might be an appendix or appendices that you need to attach. As I said though, for this video, we're going to concentrate on the introduction section, and I'll briefly show how to lay out a references section afterward as well. Now, before we get into the boring formatting details of APA style, it helps to think about what an introduction section does in general, like what it's for. And the overall purpose of your introduction section is to provide background and motivation for the work, like what we already know about something and what we don't know about the topic. And then that can lead to your research question for the current paper, kind of laying out the hypothesis that you're proposing to test. In other words, the introduction section sets up the present study that's going to be described in the rest of your paper. You can think of the normal format of an introduction section as a sort of funnel shape. It starts wide and then funnels down narrower and narrower to a specific research hypothesis. So you might begin by introducing the overall topic broadly. What's the area? Why does it matter? Then spend some paragraphs describing previous research or theory on that topic, perhaps still fairly broadly. But as you go, you might start to narrow down to talk about previous work that's closer to the specific angle that you'll be investigating. So the sort of literature review that you're doing here should be building toward something, building toward the last little bit of your introduction section here, which is where you're going to give your specific research hypothesis, what you'll be testing or what question you'll be collecting data to answer, and what answer you're predicting based on this past research we already know about. So let's briefly visit each of these steps. First, start by introducing the broad topic. You may want to begin with an interesting statement or a question about the topic to gain the reader's attention. However, if you make specific factual claims here, like say, women are known to be better than men at racquetball, then you need to provide a citation to some actual study showing or claiming that. If you're saying, war often leads to death, sure, that trivial statement is common knowledge and doesn't need a citation. But if you say something like, World War I was bloodier than any other war that has come before, you better back that claim up with a source. Now you might be wondering, what if I can't find a good source or citation for what I'm bringing up at the beginning here to get the reader hooked? And in that case, if you're not sure or you can't find a good citation for some broad statement that you made, you might turn it into a question. Instead of making the statement as a claim, you could make it a question. Is racquetball skill influenced by sex? This is also a good place in the paper to emphasize why your topic matters. Like, if we can demonstrate that there are no sex differences in racquetball, then sports organizations may finally end sex-segregated tournament structures for racquetball. There's something at stake to the question, right? So regardless, think of this area of your introduction section as giving a general description of the purpose or area of your study and why it matters. You'll hone into the specifics later. Then after that hook, that broad overview, you'll usually start diving into specific sources that have researched some aspect of this topic in the past. You're providing background information by describing and citing previous research. Now, a key here is to organize these paragraphs by little subtopics to try to make the whole introduction flow. So don't just list studies one after another with no connection. It won't necessarily be research that's answering exactly your research question. Otherwise, why are you doing your study? But rather, you'll find past work which builds a sort of foundation or provides the background or shows why your research is still needed. So maybe some earlier studies have looked at sex differences in sports other than racquetball, and maybe they found mixed results depending on the sport, right? That's a paragraph you could write about. Then maybe a paragraph about how racquetball is more similar to tennis and squash than it is to basketball and soccer. Or maybe even some things we know about sex differences in tennis and squash, right? Then maybe a paragraph about, individual differences in racquetball specifically. So maybe there is some past work on how age affects performance in racquetball, or how personality doesn't affect performance. So again, we're not getting to our specific research question of, sex differences or the lack thereof in racquetball. We're not quite hitting that yet, but we're building toward it by showing there are other individual differences in racquetball, or that there are sex differences in other sports. And then you see, that leaves open the question of racquetball. That's why we might study it here. I'm just making this up, by the way. I don't know anything about racquetball. Okay, one thing I would suggest, for each study that you bring up here, you may want to briefly describe what they did and what they found. But that means briefly describing only the relevant methodology or findings or conclusions. Like, a good example might mention a few details in the sentence without getting bogged down in irrelevancies. So in 2000, McMillan and Finley surveyed 400 college students about their drinking habits and found that blah, blah, blah. One sentence may be enough to bring the information from that study into your introduction section, unless you want to dig into the nitty-gritty of it, like if you're going to critique the methodology or argue against their logic, something like that. So it could also look like this. A previous study showed that sophomores binge drink less than college students in other years. McMillan and Finley, 2000. However, those researchers used a self-report survey, which may not provide an accurate estimate of actual drinking habits. So maybe it's helping you build up to an argument about why you're doing your study differently or not using a self-report survey, right? But what you want to avoid is getting bogged down in irrelevant details that don't matter. Like, in January of 2000, researchers named Dr. Flanders McMillan and Dr. Sally Finley, located at the University of Northwest Eastern State College, sent a 4-page anonymous survey by postal mail to 400 college students, freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior, asking them to report their drinking habits by answering 32 questions on a scale of 7 strongly agree to 1 strongly disagree. They found that blah, blah, blah. Like, a lot of that isn't really needed in most cases here, especially if you're just mentioning that stuff to be thorough rather than to help build your argument or motivate your own study's research question or methodology. Okay, so again, the idea is that throughout the introduction section, you're kind of narrowing down more and more while covering past work. That usually means each paragraph is going to get a little bit closer to the specific question that you'll be investigating, or things that will help build and motivate the question or make it clear why you studied it the way you did, methodologically speaking. Often this is the place where you start to make clear what is not known based on past research literature. Like, what are the gaps, or why do we need to do more research? In other words, the research you ended up doing. So you build up the motivation for your work by showing that there's something we don't know yet. Finally, you usually end the introduction section very specific, drilling down to your specific research hypothesis. Like at this point, you will have built up a case showing that something interesting has not been tested, or that there's a controversy that needs to be solved, or why you think certain variables might be correlated, or why it's important to know if X relates to Y, or whatever. Now you want to be specific about what you will test and what you predict you'll find. So statements like, I hypothesize that women will rank color more important than men when choosing cars, but not when choosing furniture, or whatever. Or I hypothesize that 4-year-old humans will perform better than adult chimpanzees on the A not B test of object permanence. Or I hypothesize that people diagnosed with schizophrenia will have higher scores than those without on the Torrance creativity test. Generally, it helps to make sure you literally include a statement starting, I hypothesize that. And try to be precise here. Don't just say, I hypothesize men will be aggressive. Like, aggressive compared to what? Aggressive compared to whom? Aggression measured how? So instead, get specific. Maybe, I hypothesize that men will show more aggressive behaviors than women or non-binary people when confronted with a frustrating and unwinnable task in a laboratory situation. Right? A little more specific about your hypothesis. Okay. Now that we have an idea what goes into a typical introduction section, let's see it in practice. We're going to walk through a short but kind of nicely laid out simple introduction from a published research study looking at the question of whether TV exposure in early childhood, like 1 to 3-year-olds, is associated with them having ADHD in later childhood, like at age 7. So they're going to be looking at a correlation only here. But obviously behind that, they might be curious about this because of a possible implication. There might happen to be a causal link between TV exposure and ADHD symptoms. They just won't test that causation directly in this study. It'll be purely correlational. Now, just a heads up, this is not going to be in APA style, so don't worry about the style here. We're just going to look at the content, the writing, and what they say and do. Okay, so I'm actually going to suggest you pause and read this, or at least skim through this whole introduction section of this article. It just starts halfway down the page here where the arrow is, and it ends at the bottom of the right side column. So pause, read through it, and then unpause when you're done. Go ahead now. Okay, so going back through it piece by piece, what might we notice about the order in which they covered things? Like first, it starts by introducing the topic at a very broad level. We know this is going to be about ADHD, and they're wondering what factors might affect its development. Cool. That teases the overall topic, even though they haven't mentioned television at all yet, right? But we know it's about factors that develop, lead to the development of ADHD. Then they get into some background on genetic and neurobiological influences, but say that the research has, underappreciated environmental factors so far. So, okay, we're already getting a feel for what topic they're going to be looking at overall here, which is environmental influences on developing ADHD. So they're going beyond genetic. They say genetics is there, but there's also environmental stuff. We haven't studied that much at all. That's going to motivate what they're about to talk about, right? Cool. But now we need to get into the background literature to build up what in particular they want to study here. So notice they're getting here into previous research and theory on environmental influences, or gene-environment interactions, we might say. So they're going beyond just genes as what needs to be studied in ADHD. And in a new paragraph here, right, this next bit, they bring up the idea that our brains are plastic and malleable based on what we're exposed to, like visual and auditory stimulation. Notice they haven't mentioned television at all yet, but television is a visual and auditory stimulus, so you can kind of see how they're building up to their study, which is going to be about TV exposure and later ADHD symptoms. And then what's next? Well, we continue narrowing things down in the introduction section here. So we go into a paragraph about TV specifically as a stimulating, perhaps overstimulating experience, and they just talked above about how stimulation affects brain development. So as they say here, some people have previously theorized that TV might shorten children's attention span. So boom, here's the big idea that they want to contribute some data toward kind of starting to answer better. Now in the bottom half of this paragraph though, they're mentioning some alleged effects of television viewing from past research, but mentioning that only covers older kids. No one studied toddlers yet. So you can see where they're going here. They've shown a little gap in the literature, something that hasn't been studied yet, like toddlers. So now they end with their specific research hypothesis that flows nicely out of what they've talked about leading up to it. Notice the introduction section does not have to be particularly long. 4 or 5 paragraphs may be enough if you get into the important things and build your claim here really carefully. So they say, we hypothesized that very early exposure to television during the critical periods of synaptic development, in other words, TV viewing of 1 to 3-year-olds, they hypothesized that would be associated, meaning correlated, with subsequent attentional problems. Notice they're just claiming a correlational hypothesis here. They are not going to hypothesize that TV watching causes those attention problems later, since they're only doing a correlational study design. They can only make correlational conclusions. But they do predict or hypothesize that there will be a correlation, an association, between a lot of TV watching as a toddler and attention issues later on. And they even hint here at how they'll get the data to answer this. So we're not in the method section, right? We're still in the intro section, but they kind of hint at least. Although you'll notice they're not getting into the nitty-gritty of all the methodology. So, right, they can get the details later, but they're just giving a hint here to make it clear this will be a correlational study that is just asking about TV watching and asking about attention problems, not manipulating an independent variable, not randomly assigning some kids to watch a lot of TV and other kids to watch no TV. So it's not an experimental design, just correlational. Okay. So as you saw, the introduction pretty much always ends with a clear statement of the specific research hypothesis, or hypotheses if you have multiple. This should be stated in a pretty formal, precise way, usually in terms of operational definitions of the variables. So as we saw, this often means briefly mentioning the very basics of overall methods that'll be used, like I will measure depression-like symptoms and level of religiosity in college students using a survey versus, I hypothesize that depression scores on the Beck Depression Inventory will be positively correlated with self-reported religiosity. And you might even name the scale if you found one that measures religiosity. Furthermore, I hypothesize this relationship will be stronger in younger students than older students. Something like that. Okay. Note that the way you phrase your hypothesis at the end of the introduction is pretty important, especially with regards to whether you're going to be doing a correlational study, asking if two things are associated or, if one thing goes along with another, or if you're doing a true experimental study design where you might randomly assign people to different levels of an independent variable. Like some examples for correlational studies might be worded, I hypothesize that people who report high amounts of alcohol use will tend to score higher on the multidimensional jealousy scale. Or I hypothesize that number of sexual partners in the last 5 years will be negatively correlated with number of hours of TV watched daily. Or I hypothesize that people who classify themselves as gamers will score higher than people who classify themselves as non-gamers on the Mountain Dew drinking test. Or I hypothesize that among juniors and seniors, men will rate love higher than money, but among freshmen and sophomores, men will rate money higher than love. This is all made up, right? But an experimental design might have a hypothesis that's worded more like this. I hypothesize that those assigned to the scary movie clip group will perform worse on a concentration task than those assigned to the funny movie clip group. A key phrase here, like assigned to, is a great hint to the reader that this will be an experimental design. We're not just measuring the mood variable, we are manipulating it. Okay, now I want to take a brief aside here to talk about how you word a hypothesis at the end of your introduction section. It helps to be specific in how you're operationally defining the variables you'll measure. Like, think about this. Do you directly measure a variable like weight? And I mean, sure, yeah, in pounds or kilograms or whatever, but you can put something on a scale and write down that number. What about some other variables that might show up in a psychology study, though? Do you measure happiness? Like, do you directly measure happiness? Can you grab someone's happiness and set it on a scale and write down the number? Or do you measure scores on a happiness test, or responses from 1 to 10 on a question about happiness, or maybe a behavior like number of smiles per minute? something like that. Do you measure memory? And it's an important cognitive process, sure, but do you like hold a memory ruler up to it and see what number it's closest to on the ruler? Or do you measure number of words out of 40 recalled after a 5-minute delay? Or scores on the reading span task? Or number of questions correct out of 10 asking for details from a previously seen picture? Or perhaps even volume of the hippocampus of the brain, right? It's a brain area associated with forming new memories, although in that case, why not just test memory performance directly like in the examples above? The point is, when it comes time at the end of your introduction section to present your specific research hypothesis, try to word it in terms of how you're actually measuring the relevant variables, in terms of the operational definitions you'll be using. Let's take an example. Imagine you're going to write a hypothesis for comparing math anxiety in 2 groups. A very weak hypothesis wording would be, I will compare the groups on math. That's just so damn generic and vague, and also doesn't tell us what you expect or predict as the likely outcome. A slightly better but still weak version might be, I hypothesize that Group A will have more math anxiety than Group B. Now that's better because there's a real prediction in there, and it's precise about studying math anxiety specifically. But consider this much stronger wording. I hypothesize that Group A will have significantly lower scores on the mathematic self-efficacy scale than Group B. We now have an idea how this study will be measuring math anxiety. Whether we think a self-report scale is the best way to measure anxiety versus something else, that's a different question. But you can see how it's clear to the reader how we are going to measure math anxiety in this particular study. Now here's a question. Do you think this study is going to be purely correlational, or do you think it's going to be an experiment? You might pause and guess before moving on. Thing is, it's not really clear from the wording here. Like, imagine one possibility is that Group A is people who identify as male and Group B is people who identify as female. Then testing whether one of those groups scores higher on math self-efficacy or on math anxiety, that is purely correlational research. But imagine instead that Group A was people who were randomly assigned to maybe read a boring essay first before the math self-efficacy scale, and Group B is randomly assigned to read an empowering essay first. Why, that sounds like a genuine experimental design, something that can tell us about causation. Or maybe Group A is people diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and Group B are controls with no diagnosis. Again, that would just be correlational. We're just comparing 2 pre-existing groups. So if we include that phrasing or have made clear previously who Group A and Group B are, then even at this early into our paper, the end of the introduction section, readers will already have a decent inkling of how we'll be answering the research question. And it helps to give that hint of whether you'll be doing a correlational study or more of an experiment study. Another example, just a silly one. Imagine throughout your introduction section, you're building up to a hypothesis for correlating, fartiness, like gassiness, and popularity. A very weak phrasing might be, I believe fartiness will cause unpopularity. This is particularly bad because I just said we're looking into the correlation of these variables. So talking about causation here is wildly inappropriate. More inappropriate than farting, scientifically speaking. A better but still weak phrasing might be, I hypothesize people who fart a lot will have fewer friends. And that's fine. It's clearly just correlational, which fits what we'll be doing in the study. But we can probably word it even better, especially if we can hint at how we'll be operationalizing the variables. So a stronger hypothesis might be worded like this. I hypothesize a negative correlation between number of farts per day, measured by butt brand fartometer installed in their pants, and number of friends on Snapchat. Now, what happens when I find out that a higher number of farts goes with a lower number of friends, and a lower number of farts goes with a higher number of friends? Great. Hypothesis supported. But does farting cause you to lose or avoid friends? Maybe, maybe not. Does holding it in cause you to gain friends? Maybe, maybe not. We are clearly doing a correlational study here, so we can't answer causation questions, and we shouldn't be talking about our study as if it will answer such things. After all, when 2 variables are correlated, it might be because some third variable is behind the scenes connecting them indirectly even though neither of them affects the other. For example, I don't know, maybe BMI affects number of farts and number of Snapchat friends, or whatever. Any number of third variables is possible for explaining a correlation we find, if we find something like this, without us knowing what the causation really is. And that is okay. It is okay to do a purely correlational study design and to not be able to directly answer causation questions. That is still an important part of science and of building our understanding. But it's crucial in those cases to not use causation wording and to not talk as if you'll answer questions about what causes what, whether one thing increases or decreases some other thing. Stick to correlational wording if that's the design you're using. And when you mention your variables in the research hypothesis at the end of your intro, like I said, try to be specific about what you're measuring, and it helps a lot here to be thinking or getting specific about whether you're measuring things as a number or as a category, specifically because that will later determine things like what statistics you can use to analyze the data. So for example, things measured quantitatively as a number might be things like score from 1 to 50 on the Frankenstein anxiety scale, or score when asked from 1 to 7, how much do you like cake, with 1 meaning I hate it and 7 meaning I'm Dr. Stone, or grams of poop a male capuchin monkey makes in a day, or number of calories consumed, number of minutes on the phone, amount of money for yearly salary in the household. Those are all number variables, right? Quantitative. On the other hand, sometimes you're measuring a variable in a categorical way. In other words, the value you're writing down for each person will be categorical. Try to phrase it that way when describing it in your hypothesis statement. So that would be things like gender, maybe if you're measuring it with 3 categorical levels, like male, female, non-binary, or what group someone is assigned to, like 3 levels where you require someone to do high, low, or no exercise. Or categories like socioeconomic status might be categorized as lower, middle, upper class. Or maybe, I guess for an experiment, assigned socioeconomic status where I somehow make you poor or I make you rich. Maybe because I had a lot of grant money to throw around in this project. Or maybe it's just a simulation or a game in a lab and I can assign people to have a certain SES category, right? Or any other categorical variable, like whether you own a car or whatever. The point is, even when you're just stating your hypothesis at the end of your intro section, you should be thinking in terms of how you'll measure, how you'll operationalize the variables at play. Okay, enough about the content of an introduction section. Let's briefly talk about the APA formatting, like how you lay it out properly in APA style. And thankfully, the basic rules are pretty simple. First off, this is going to be weird, but in APA style, you don't put a heading at the top of this section and label it Introduction. You don't write the word Introduction at the beginning of the body of your paper like you might expect. Instead, you actually write out the title of your paper on the first line, capitalizing all the important words, centering this bit in the center, and put it in bold font. So like my title goes here, right up top, in the center, in bold. It's a little weird since you might already have a title page earlier on before you got to the body of the paper. And before you started the intro, you already got the title up there. But yes, you literally write the title again here at the top of your introduction section. And do not use the word introduction. Then you just start your first paragraph on the next line with an initial indent before the first word. So you will indent the start of each paragraph. And also, one other rule to keep in mind, you do double space everything. Basically, the whole paper in APA style gets double spaced. So here's an example of an APA style paper formatted properly. This is an introduction section. Notice the title up top in bold at the center. Notice that each new paragraph gets indented. As far as what font to use, APA style these days actually suggests the default font of your word processing app. So that ends up being something along the lines of 11-point Calibri or Aptos or Area or Georgia or 12-point Times New Roman. Anything standard like that is totally fine. Just don't use a weird font or change the size around significantly. And as I said, you double space the entire paper throughout. And then if you're wondering about margins should just be 1 inch all around. Pretty standard. But as far as APA style rules for formatting your introduction section, that's basically it. Now, it's possible with a longer introduction section or later in your paper, you might want to break things down into subsections. And you can definitely do that with a second level heading, like a subsection within your introduction or within your later method section would just have a bold heading that in this case is left aligned, like you see here. If it helps to organize a section to put it into subsections, that is definitely allowed. You can even drill down to a third level of subheadings, which is the one they have here in italics that's still left aligned. And if you absolutely need a fourth level of subheading to really break things up, then that's where you would indent, like this bit here where it says meta-analysis 1, indent it with no italics. But usually it's unnecessary to go that deep. Honestly, most papers will be fine just keeping the whole introduction section under its own main heading and not breaking it up into subsections at all. Okay, enough about formatting introduction sections. One thing we need to think about at this point is that we have just cited a bunch of sources within our introduction, so we need to provide the full source information somewhere. And that, my friends, will be in the references section at the back of the paper after the main body of text. And how do you format the references section in APA style, you may ask? The main things to remember are start it on its own page, put the word references in the center up top in bold, keep the double spacing that you've had throughout the whole paper, it still applies down here. And then within this references section, you're going to give an entry for each source that you used. And we do a fancy little hanging indent for each of those entries so that it stands out visually. And then the whole list of sources will be organized alphabetically based on whoever the first author is. But to be clear, you don't reorganize the list of authors within a given reference, within a given source. You keep them in the order listed in the original source, since that tells you who did the most work. You're just putting all the sources into a nice alphabetical ordering here as sort of a list. So here's an example of what that would look like. Notice it starts on its own page with the word references, bold and centered up top. You have articles by Bago and colleagues alphabetically coming before Braunstein, and Braunstein alphabetically before Charnas, and so on. The whole thing is double spaced, but now you see what I mean by hanging indent. The first line of each entry is not indented, but all the additional lines of that entry are indented. You'll have an entry here for every source you cited in the body of the paper, and each reference should be an APA style. That means whenever possible, like for most peer-reviewed journal articles, you include a DOI, a digital object identifier, which is those blue links that you see here at the end of each article's entry. It'll always start with https:// and then 10 something, 10 and some numbers and letters. Now, one thing to be aware of and try to avoid is if you found the article on a university library, you don't want to just copy the URL into your browser, which might be specific to your university's library and may not work for everyone else. Don't just paste in the URL that you're looking at when you get the paper. Don't paste in the URL that's on your browser when you're looking at the library, like looking at the paper on your library site. Instead, you have to actually find the DOI itself, which is usually listed right near the author information up at the top of the paper or the top of the website where you found the paper. Again, it'll always have the http doi.org and 10 something. Now, some common errors to watch out for when you're doing APA style references are all the little details, like especially which parts get italicized or not. For a journal article, you do not do anything special with the article title. Don't italicize the title. Don't capitalize all the words. Don't put quotes around it. Just write the article title out in normal sentence case. But then the name of the journal, that has all the important words capitalized, and that is in italics. Plus the volume number of the journal is in italics. Think of it like the italics is the part you'd be looking at if you were browsing covers or browsing spines on a physical library shelf. You would see the name of the journal and which volume it is. So those bits are in italics for our reference. Then the issue number, the bit in parentheses here with a 2, sometimes that's there, sometimes it's not, but that is just to narrow it down within the volume, inside the volume. So it is not in italics. nor is the page number that comes after that. Page number is not in italics. Now, I realize this stuff is arbitrary. It is just convention, so it can feel a little annoying to have to learn these little details, but we keep things consistent so that readers can reliably glance at a reference section and quickly glean the necessary information. Sometimes following arbitrary conventions helps the whole system run smoother for everyone. Now, as far as common errors back in the introduction section, I'd say the biggest is usually failure to cite factual claims or statements that you make. Like, if it is not common knowledge, or if you're not sure, then you should be citing a source for any factual claim you make. If you can't do that, or if it'd be too much work for, finding something where you consider this not that essential, then think about whether you can rephrase it as a question, as a what-if hypothetical, instead of saying it as a fact. That way, you may still be able to bring up, why the topic might be important or what's at stake, even if you aren't claiming to know something already. My advice, though, if you're stating facts and not sure if it's common knowledge, is that it's better to oversight than to undercite, especially when you're first learning technical writing like this. Now, what if you end up spending an entire paragraph or even just a few sentences describing information from some source? Do you put a parenthetical cite to that same source at the end of every single sentence that happens to be referring to it? That honestly gets really redundant and it's kind of unnecessary. But also, don't wait until the very end of the paragraph or the end of all those sentences to cite what source you're discussing. Instead, in the first sentence where you directly refer to some source, that's the sentence where you should cite it. Put the parenthetical there, or even work the author and year into the sentence if you want to. But then if you go on to keep discussing that same source, then assuming that it's clear from your writing you're still discussing the same source, then you don't need to recite it there. If you move on to a new topic, though, or other sources, and then you circle back around to this one, that's when you would cite it again. And if you cite it in one sentence, and then the following sentences are kind of ambiguous, where it's unclear if you're still referring to that first source, or you've moved on to your own ideas, then try to use clearer wording. Like I highlighted here how you might phrase things. The same study showed that blah, blah, blah. Or if you just mentioned, Bob and Juan's study in the last sentence, and the next sentence continues, they also analyzed gender and age differences, it's pretty clear we're still talking about the same study, so no need to cite it again. Just make sure it's clear to the reader what you're referring to in any given sentence, whether you make that clear by context or by citing again if it's necessary for clarity. And finally, make sure to proofread your work, whether for nitty-gritty mechanical bits like punctuation and spelling, because those can cause some miscommunications, or higher level stuff for awkward grammar and readability. After all, if someone can't understand your ideas when they're reading your paper, then you're much less likely to convince them of what you're trying to convince them of, or they might even come away with the entire wrong idea about your work. Honestly, even though this kind of writing often makes people think of complicated and technical language, it's usually much more effective and better to use simple language and to express your ideas clearly rather than trying to use flowery prose or big technical words. So don't rely on a thesaurus to try and sound smart. Simple language is actually fine, especially if it helps you be precise and clear and readable. And finally, beware about relying too much on the wording used in your sources. Especially if they use a lot of high-level technical language, you might be tempted to just copy their wording. Perhaps you use a thesaurus to change some words here or there. But not only does that sometimes make for poor garbled writing, but it's still plagiarism to rely on the original sentence structure even if you change some words here and there. So if you find yourself relying too heavily on the wording in the source, try this little tip. Read a paragraph in the source, then look away, completely look away from the source, and see if you can say what that paragraph was about in your own words. If not, you might not have really understood what you were reading in the first place. And if that's the case, instead of plagiarizing the source, whether it's intentional or unintentional, instead go back and read more carefully, or look up unfamiliar terms if you need to, Or perhaps you even decide that this source is a little beyond your level of training and you try and find a more appropriate source for your purposes. But none of it is worth the risk of plagiarizing, which can lead to failed assignments or courses, losing recommendations and references from your professors, or losing a job, as many have when their plagiarism was discovered later on. So just stick to your own words, simple language is fine, and cite any ideas or words that you get from other people, and you will develop better and better writing over time. You've got this.